Here's something that should bother you. Psychologists can look at two total strangers, glance at their driveway, their watch, and the label on their jacket, and confidently guess which one has more money sitting in the bank. And they will be wrong more often than they're right. Not because the science is bad, but because the entire visible signal system humans use to spot wealth got quietly hijacked decades ago, and almost nobody noticed it happening. The man who looks like he's behind is very often the one winning. The man who looks like he's already made it is very often 3 missed paychecks away from a very bad year. This isn't random, and it isn't a coincidence. There's an actual psychological pattern underneath it, a specific set of mental habits that separate the people who look broke at 40 and retire with millions from the people who look rich at 40 and retire with nothing. And once you understand what that pattern actually is, you'll never look at a driveway the same way again. My name is Mike, and today we are demystifying the psychology behind why some people build wealth quietly while other people just perform it loudly. If you've ever felt behind because your car is older than your favorite pair of shoes, stick around, because today we're breaking down exactly what's happening inside the heads of the people who look broke and retire rich. Hit that subscribe button before we get into it, because this is one of those topics people come back to the moment their own numbers finally start moving. Let's start with the paradox itself, because the data on this is almost comically consistent. Ramsey Solutions ran the largest behavioral study of actual American millionaires ever conducted, over 10,000 of them, and the average one drives a 4-year-old car with about 41,000 miles on it. Not a G-Wagon, not a Tesla Plaid, a 4-year-old Honda or Toyota that's been through one family vacation and a lot of drive-thrus. Thomas Stanley, who spent 40 years studying wealthy Americans before anyone else was asking these questions, found that 86% of luxury vehicles in this country are driven by people who are not millionaires. Read that again. The overwhelming majority of expensive cars on the road belong to people performing wealth, not people who have it. Half the millionaires in Stanley's research never paid more than $400 for a suit in their life. Half never paid more than $235 for a watch. The top 5 professions among American millionaires are engineer, accountant, teacher, manager, and attorney. Doctor doesn't crack the top 5. Hedge fund manager doesn't either. So if the data is this consistent, this repeatable, this boring, why does it feel so counterintuitive every single time? Because your brain isn't built to read balance sheets. It's built to read signals. And for most of human history, visible spending actually was a decent signal of resources. If a caveman had a bigger fire, more furs, more food, he probably did have more. That instinct is still fully installed in your skull. The problem is that somewhere in the last 50 years, the cost of faking that signal collapsed to almost nothing. A car lease, a credit card, an 84-month loan. Suddenly, anyone can rent the appearance of wealth for a few $100s a month, and your ancient brain has no idea it's being fooled. This is where the first real psychological mechanism kicks in, and it has a name. Behavioral economists call it countersignaling. When you actually have status, advertising it becomes redundant, because the people who matter already know, and proving it to strangers offers you nothing. It's the people in the middle of the distribution, the ones who need outsiders to perceive a status they haven't fully secured yet, who signal the hardest. There was a study published in the Journal of Marketing that found something fascinating along these lines. The wealthiest consumers actually preferred luxury goods with quiet, subtle branding, small logos, muted signifiers, almost nothing you'd recognize walking past them. Meanwhile, the people spending the highest percentage of their income on luxury tended to buy the loudest, most heavily branded versions, regardless of their actual net worth. In other words, the louder the logo, the less money is usually standing behind it. This isn't a moral judgment, it's just how the psychology plays out. A man who is secure doesn't need his driveway to argue on his behalf. A man who is still climbing does, whether he realizes it or not. And here's the part that should really land. The resale data backs this up in a way that's almost brutal. The Birkin bag, marketed for years as the ultimate investment purchase, dropped from selling at 2.2 times retail in 2022 to about 1.4 times retail by late 2025. Rolex prices on the secondary market are down more than 15% from their 2022 peak. These weren't supposed to lose value. They were supposed to be armor against inflation, proof of taste, proof of arrival. Instead, they behaved exactly like what they actually are: expensive costumes that depreciate the second the applause stops. The second mechanism is even more interesting because it has almost nothing to do with money and everything to do with identity. There's research going back decades on delayed gratification, the famous Marshmallow experiments, where researchers offered small children one treat now or two treats if they could wait. The kids who could wait went on, decades later, to show better outcomes across almost every measurable category: income, health, relationships. For years, people assumed this meant willpower was the deciding factor. But newer analysis complicates that story in a useful way. It's not really about raw willpower, it's about environment and identity. Kids who trusted that waiting would actually pay off, who had evidence that adults kept their promises, were far more likely to wait. The people who build quiet wealth as adults aren't running on superhuman discipline either. They've just built an environment where the disciplined choice is the automatic one. They set up the transfer to the brokerage account the day the raise hits, before the money ever touches a checking account where it could be reasoned with. This matters because willpower is a terrible long-term strategy. It's a muscle that gets tired by Thursday evening after a stressful week, and the moment it gets tired, the brain reaches for the easiest available comfort, which is almost always spending. The people who look broke at 40 didn't win some daily battle against temptation for 20 straight years. They removed the battle. They built a version of their financial life where the responsible decision required zero decisions at all. Let me show you what this actually looks like between two real people, because the abstraction doesn't hit the same way a real comparison does. Meet Walter and Derek. Same neighborhood, same age, same income bracket, both around $118,000 a year by their early 40s. Walter drove a Civic with a cracked cup holder and a check engine light he'd been meaning to look at. Derek drove a leased Silverado, black on black, payment just under $900 a month. At the office holiday party, somebody joked that Walter's car looked like a college kid's car. Walter laughed along and went home and didn't think about it again. Derek, meanwhile, had already started noticing the newer trucks in the parking lot, the ones a trim level above his. That noticing is not a character flaw. It's social comparison theory doing exactly what it evolved to do, which is measure your position against the people closest to you rather than against some abstract national average. The problem is that the reference group most people compare themselves to today isn't their actual financial peers anymore. It's whoever they happen to park next to, scroll past, or sit across from at a barbecue, and that group is picked almost at random. Walter's reference group, without him ever choosing it, happened to include people who talked about their 401k contribution rate instead of their new watch. Derek's reference group talked about upgrades. Neither man consciously selected these circles. The circles simply shaped what felt normal. And normal is one of the most powerful forces in personal finance because it operates below the level where you'd ever notice it happening. Here's where hedonic adaptation comes in, and this is genuinely one of the more underrated concepts in all of behavioral psychology. Hedonic adaptation is the finding that humans return to a fairly stable baseline of happiness after almost any positive event. A raise, a new truck, a bigger house, usually within about 3 months. That truck feels incredible for the first 2 weeks. By week 12, it's just the vehicle you drive to work. The leather seats stop registering as leather seats. They're just seats. But the payment never adapts. The payment shows up every single month at full emotional cost, while the pleasure it was supposed to buy quietly evaporates. Derek felt this exact pattern without having a name for it. 6 months into owning the truck, he wasn't unhappy exactly. He just didn't feel the thing he thought he'd feel. So when the next model year came out with a slightly nicer trim package, some part of his brain reasoned that maybe this next one would finally deliver the feeling the last one didn't. That's the hedonic treadmill in action, and it's one of the main engines quietly draining wealth from people who otherwise look completely responsible on paper. Now, before I keep going, if any of this is making you rethink your own driveway or your own credit card statement, that's exactly the reaction I want, because that's usually where people finally hit subscribe and stick around, because the next part is where the actual math gets interesting. Let's talk about what happens when raises show up, because this is the moment lifestyle creep gets its foot in the door, and it rarely looks dramatic. At 44, both men got roughly the same bump, close to $12,000 a year. Derek loosened the budget in ways that felt completely reasonable. Better restaurants, a nicer vacation rental, a few convenience purchases that made the week smoother. None of it looked reckless in isolation. That's precisely how lifestyle inflation operates. It doesn't kick the door in, it walks through, carrying grocery bags, one completely defensible purchase at a time. Morgan Housel put it about as well as anyone ever has when he wrote that saving is simply the gap between your ego and your income. Walter felt the same pull Derek did. He wasn't a monk, he wanted to loosen up too. So he let part of the raise go toward life, a better family trip, a nicer anniversary dinner. And before the rest of it could get absorbed into daily spending, he raised his automatic transfer percentage to match the raise. The dollar amount going toward lifestyle barely moved. The dollar amount building his future moved considerably. Same raise, same starting point, completely different psychological handling of it. This connects to something researchers at Princeton documented that should genuinely concern you if you've never heard it before. Financial stress measurably reduces cognitive function by an amount roughly equivalent to losing an entire night of sleep, or about 13 IQ points. They called it the bandwidth tax. Being financially stretched doesn't just feel bad, it makes you worse at making good decisions, which tends to produce more decisions that create more stress, which produces less bandwidth, and the cycle feeds itself. Derek wasn't in crisis by any means, but the truck payment, the remodel balance, the lifestyle upgrades, all stacked into a background hum of low-grade financial pressure that never fully switched off. Walter, with his boring, automated system, was operating with more available mental bandwidth than he realized because there was simply less to worry about. Fewer open financial tabs running in the background of his brain. There's also a well-documented gap between what investments earn and what investors actually earn, and it's driven almost entirely by psychology rather than by bad luck. Research firm Dalbar has tracked this for decades and consistently finds that the average equity investor underperforms the market itself by several percentage points a year, sometimes considerably more in volatile years. Not because the funds perform worse, but because people panic sell during corrections and buy back in once things feel safe again, which is, of course, right after prices have already recovered. This is loss aversion, a concept Daniel Kahneman spent much of his career studying, the finding that the pain of losing money registers roughly twice as intensely in the brain as the pleasure of gaining the same amount. Walter never developed a strong reaction to market drops because he'd built the habit of not looking at his account very often. Ignorance, in this narrow and specific case, functioned as a genuine strategy. Derek checked his account more, felt the dips more sharply because of loss aversion, and was more likely to make an emotional move at exactly the wrong moment. The irony is that doing less, checking less, reacting less, was the more sophisticated behavior the entire time, even though it looked like indifference from the outside. Underneath all of this sits one more psychological force that ties the whole thing together, and it's about time horizon. Charlie Munger, Warren Buffett's late business partner, used to tell people that the first $100,000 is the hardest part of building wealth, and he wasn't exaggerating for effect. It requires walking everywhere, skipping things, doing all the heavy lifting yourself before compounding shows up to help. What almost nobody mentions is that roughly 97% of Buffett's own net worth was accumulated after his 60th birthday. His edge was never picking better stocks than everyone else. His edge was starting at age 10 and simply never stopping. Humans are biologically wired to want the payoff by Friday. The entire mechanism of compounding is specifically designed to deny you that. Walter, without ever reading a behavioral finance textbook, had internalized a genuinely long time horizon. He thought in decades. Derek, like most people, thought in months, the length of a lease, the length of a loan term, the length of a vacation booking window. That difference in time horizon quietly decided almost everything else. By the time both men hit their late 50s, the visible story had completely flipped from what the neighborhood assumed. Walter still drove something unremarkable. Derek had upgraded the truck twice more, financed a kitchen, and was still making a payment that would have made a banker wince. When a round of layoffs hit both their companies the same year, Derek needed his job to keep cooperating with him. The truck needed it. The remodel balance needed it. Walter wanted his job. He liked the work, but he didn't need it in the same desperate way, and that difference showed up in every conversation he had with his manager for the rest of that year, whether he ever said a word about money or not. When Walter eventually retired, the number that came back from HR was just north of $1.3 million. Derek, similar income for almost 2 decades, had around $310,000 saved, a truck payment still running, and a retirement date that kept sliding further out every time somebody asked him about it. None of this makes Derek a failure or Walter some kind of financial genius. Derek worked hard and made choices that looked completely rational in the moment they were made. That's actually the most important thing to understand about this entire pattern. It was never about intelligence. It was about which psychological defaults each man happened to install early and never bother to question. The people who look broke at 40 aren't secretly miserable ascetics gritting their teeth through life. Most of them genuinely don't care that much about the driveway because they stopped needing the driveway to say something on their behalf years ago. If you've been watching this channel for a while, you've probably heard me mention the gas station attendant in Vermont who wore a jacket held together with a safety pin and quietly built an $8 million portfolio nobody knew about until he passed away. Same underlying psychology. The visible life and the actual balance sheet were simply never trying to match. So here's what I actually want you to take from this. You cannot force yourself into having more discipline through sheer willpower, because willpower runs out by Thursday for absolutely everyone, no exceptions. What you can do is copy the environment rather than the discipline. Automate the transfer before the money ever reaches a decision point. Choose your comparison group on purpose instead of letting a parking lot or a group chat choose it for you. Notice hedonic adaptation the moment it's happening, that flat feeling 12 weeks after a purchase, and let it inform the next decision instead of ignoring it. Raise your savings rate the same week a raise lands, before your lifestyle even notices the money exists. None of this requires more income. It requires fewer decisions made in real time and more decisions made once, in advance, when you're calm and not standing in a dealership under fluorescent lighting with a salesman waiting on your answer. If this changed how you're going to look at your own driveway, your own closet, or the next raise that lands in your account, don't just sit on that feeling and let it fade by tomorrow morning, because that's exactly the kind of insight that evaporates the way a new truck does if you don't do something with it. Smash the like button right now so this actually reaches the next person who needs to hear it instead of getting buried under another video about picking stocks. Drop a comment telling me whether you're more of a Walter or more of a Derek right now. Honestly, no judgment either way. And if you actually want to become the kind of person this video just described, instead of just nodding along for 20 minutes and closing the tab, hit subscribe, because that's the whole identity shift in miniature. The small automatic decision made once instead of the willpower you'll need to remember to come back on your own. I'll see you in the next one.